"Do not do it, Elias," Marcus screamed. His voice was no longer the smooth rasp that sounded like whiskey. It was a jagged shriek that bounced off the glass walls of the 88th floor. He was on his knees. His suit that cost $5,000 was soaked in spilled champagne and cold sweat. He was clawing at the fabric of my trousers with fingers that were shaking so hard he could not hold the cloth. "Please, Elias, I have a family. I have a legacy. Think about the empire we built together." I looked down at the man who had called me a janitor 10 minutes ago. I looked at the coffee beans that were scattered across the floor like tiny black teeth. 10 minutes earlier, Marcus had been a god. He was standing on top of the mahogany table that was polished to a mirror shine. He was spitting coffee shells onto my shoes and laughing with the junior traders. He had taken my steel tuning fork and crushed it under his heel. The snap of the metal had been the loudest sound in the room. "You are a liability, Elias," Marcus had sneered. "You are a dinosaur that is slow and pathetic. I am the king of high-frequency trading. I have manually bypassed every single safety buffer that you created. Do you smell that, Elias? That is the smell of money that moves at the speed of light." I smelled it, but it was not the smell of money. It was the smell of silicon that was burning. Behind the glass of the server racks, the cooling fans were screaming at a maximum RPM. The fiber optic cables were glowing an orange that looked angry. Marcus had pushed the settlement engine so hard that the hardware was literally melting. "I told you the audit logs were drifting, Marcus," I said. My voice was as cold as the liquid nitrogen that flowed in the cooling pipes. "I told you the system could not handle the friction. Friction is for losers," Marcus had shouted. He was waving a golden pen in the air. He had just signed a fraudulent SEC affidavit. He thought his signature was a magic spell that could stop the laws of physics. According to the company charter, Elias is fired for gross incompetence and industrial sabotage. "Security, get this garbage out of my sight." But the guards did not take me away. They stood still because the elevator doors had opened. It was a team of federal agents led by Inspector Sterling from the SEC. They were wearing silk gloves that were white and carried a federal seizure warrant. "Marcus Vane," the inspector said, "your firm is being liquidated for securities fraud that is massive and the destruction of evidence that was intentional." They grabbed Marcus. They dragged him toward the elevator. But the real execution began inside the black SUV that was parked at the curb. Marcus sat between two agents. He was panting. He looked at the agent on his left. He saw the name tag. "Agent Miller." "Miller?" Marcus whispered. His eyes turned wide. "I know you. You were an intern at Vespa 5 years ago. I remember you. I fired you because your reaction time on the trade desk was too slow." Agent Miller did not look at him. He stared straight ahead. "You fired me because I told you the audit trails were incomplete, Mr. Vane," the agent said. "You told me that people who worry about milliseconds are too slow for Wall Street." "Listen, Miller," Marcus hissed. He leaned in close. "I have a private fund. It is a Zurich account that has $12 million. It is not in the books. I can transfer half to an offshore wallet for you right now. Just tell Sterling that the server smoke was a fire drill. We can walk away from this. Think about your future." Agent Miller finally turned his head. He looked at Marcus with a face that was like stone. "Mr. Vane, I am a federal agent who earns a government salary, and I am the one who spent the last 3 years tracking your Zurich account. Ilias Thorne gave us the keys 6 months ago. We were just waiting for you to sign that fake affidavit." Marcus froze. The hope in his eyes died. "The money is already gone, Mr. Vane," Miller said. "You are not offering me a bribe. You are offering me a confession that I am recording on this SUV dash camera." Marcus let out a sound that was like a wounded animal. He began to beat his head against the bulletproof glass of the door. He was a king who had just realized his crown was made of lead. The doors of the SUV opened in front of the Vespa headquarters. The air in the street was cold and felt like needles. Agent Miller gripped the arm of Marcus and pulled him out of the vehicle. The crowd that was gathered in the lobby was huge. There were bankers who were wealthy and reporters who were hungry for a story. They all had their phones out. Marcus tried to hide his face. He tried to pull his jacket over his head, but his jacket was torn and looked like a rag. Elias Thorne stood in the center of the lobby. I was waiting for him. I was standing next to a ticker that was digital and displayed the market data in real time. The numbers were red and looked like blood. "Look at him," someone shouted from the back of the room. It was Sarah, the junior researcher whom Marcus had called a failure in front of the whole firm. "Marcus, how is the latency in those handcuffs?" she laughed. Marcus stopped. He looked at Sarah with eyes that were full of hate. "You are a nobody," he screamed. "You are a ghost that I created." Agent Miller shoved Marcus forward. "Keep moving, Mr. Vane," the agent said. "You are not a god anymore. You are just a suspect who is being processed." They reached the security desk. This was the place where Marcus had ordered the guards to throw me out only 2 hours ago. Now the guards stood still and looked at the floor. They did not want to look at the man who used to pay their salaries. Inspector Sterling stepped forward. He was holding a bag that was plastic and clear. "Mr. Vane," he said, "under the authority of the Securities and Exchange Commission, we are seizing all personal property that was purchased with the funds of the firm." "Wait," Marcus shrieked. "You cannot do that. My watch is my own." The inspector did not listen. He reached down and unbuckled the watch from the wrist of Marcus. It was a Patek Philippe that was made of gold and cost $200,000. Sterling dropped the watch into the bag. The sound it made was heavy and final. Then came the phone. Then came the wallet that was made of leather and filled with black credit cards. Each item was a brick in the wall that Marcus had built around himself. Now the wall was falling down. I walked up to Marcus. I looked at the watch in the bag. "Marcus," I said, "you always said that time is money, but you were wrong. Time is the only thing you cannot buy." "Elias, please," Marcus whispered. His voice was a thin thread that was ready to snap. "I can give you the keys to the dark pool. I can show you how to hide the trades from the SEC. We can be partners. You have the brains and I have the connections." I looked at the crowd. I looked at the people who had worked for Marcus. They were the ones who stayed in the office for 80 hours a week while Marcus was on his yacht. "Partners?" I asked. I turned to the crowd. "Did any of you feel like partners when Marcus was taking his $6 million bonus? Did you feel like partners when he was firing you to save a millisecond of speed?" "No," the crowd roared. The sound was like a wave that crashed against the marble walls. I turned back to Marcus. "The dark pool is dead, Marcus. I have already decrypted the logs. Every trade that was hidden and every fee that was stolen is now on the server of the SEC. You are not offering me a partnership. You are offering me a seat in the prison cell next to yours." Marcus let out a roar of rage. He tried to lunge at me. He wanted to wrap his hands around my neck, but his reaction time was too slow. He was a man who lived in the world of high-frequency trading, where a nanosecond was an eternity. But in the real world, he was just a middle-aged man who was out of shape. Agent Miller caught him and slammed him against the security desk. The impact was loud and made the glass rattle. The crowd began to cheer. They were not just happy to see him fall. They were happy to see the system that was broken finally work. "Sarah, come here," I said. She walked over to me. Her face was bright and full of a hope that was new. I took a tablet from the desk. I opened the file for the bonus pool of the firm. Marcus had set aside $10 million for himself and his loyal traders. I tapped the screen. I authorized a transfer that was immediate. "Sarah," I said, "I just sent a payment of $50,000 to your account, and the same amount is going to every person on this floor who was abused by Marcus Vane. This is the friction that Marcus hated. This is the cost of being honest." The lobby erupted in a noise that was deafening. People were crying. They were hugging each other. Marcus watched the screen of the tablet. He watched his money disappear into the bank accounts of the people he had mocked. "That is my money," Marcus wailed. He was sobbing now. "You are stealing my life." "No, Marcus," I said. "I am just balancing the books, and your account is now at 0. The federal courthouse was a building that was made of grey stone and felt like a tomb. Marcus Vane sat at the defense table. He was wearing a suit that was cheap and provided by the government because his own clothes had been seized as evidence. He kept looking at the clock on the wall. The second hand moved with a tick that was slow and rhythmic. To a man who lived in the world of high-frequency trading, that clock was a torture device. "Where is my lawyer?" Marcus hissed to the bailiff. "I pay the firm of Sterling and Gable $5 million a year. Why are they not here?" The bailiff did not look at him. He stood like a statue that was made of bronze. The side door opened. A man walked in, but it was not the famous lawyer of Marcus. It was a junior associate who looked tired and carried a briefcase that was scuffed. "Mr. Vane," the associate whispered, "the senior partners have dropped your case." "What?" Marcus roared. His voice echoed in the room that was silent and cold. "They cannot do that. I have a contract." The associate leaned in close. "The firm has a clause that is standard for ethics," he said, "and since your Zurich accounts are empty, there is no money to pay the retainer. You are a client who is high risk and has zero balance. You are on your own, Marcus." Marcus fell back into his chair. His face was the color of a screen that had no power. But then, he saw me. I walked into the courtroom and sat in the front row. I was holding a folder that was thick and contained the final audit of the dark pool. Marcus stood up. He let out a laugh that was sharp and filled with a confidence that was fake. The dead cat bounce had started. "You think you won, Elias?" Marcus shouted. He looked at the judge who had just entered the room. "Your Honor, this man is a liar. He has no proof that I signed those trades. The system has a delay that is natural. The logs that Elias is showing are just a glitch that was caused by his own software. You cannot convict a man based on a glitch that is 10 milliseconds long." The judge was a woman who was old and had eyes that were like ice. She looked at Marcus over her glasses. "Sit down, Mr. Vane," she said. Her voice was a sound that was heavy and carried the weight of the law. I was called to the witness stand. I did not look at Marcus. I looked at the screen that was mounted on the wall. "Mr. Thorne," the prosecutor said, "can you explain the signature on these trades?" I opened the folder. "Marcus did not sign with a pen," I said. "He signed with a heartbeat that was digital. In the world of high-frequency trading, we use a key that is unique to the CEO. Marcus thought he could hide behind the speed. He thought that if a trade happened in a nanosecond, no one could see the intent. I tapped a key on my laptop. The screen showed a line of code that was glowing, but I built a trap that is called a latency snare." I continued. "Every time Marcus bypassed a safety buffer, the system did not just log the trade, it captured the RPM of his cooling fans. It captured the heat of the server that was rising, and it captured the biometric data of his thumb on the master override." "Look at the timestamp," I said. "The trade happened in 1 millisecond, but the intent to commit fraud lasted for 3 seconds. In the world of the law, Marcus, 3 seconds is an eternity." Marcus began to sweat. He was looking at the clock again. The ticking was driving him mad. "Why is this taking so long?" he screamed. "Just make a decision. The data is right there. You are all too slow." He was experiencing a cognitive crash that was total. His brain was tuned to a speed that the human world could not match. Every second of the trial felt like a year of imprisonment. "Elias, please," Marcus shouted. He was now in the stage of the cornered rat. "I will give you the names of the board. I will tell you about the Dark Pool Squad. It is a group of 7 CEOs who fix the prices. I have the data in a drive that is hidden in my boat. Just let me go to the boat." The prosecutor smiled. "We already have the boat, Mr. Vane," she said, "and we have the drive. Agent Miller seized it an hour ago." Marcus let out a sound that was like a balloon that was losing air. He looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. He was a man who had tried to outrun time, and he had finally hit the wall. The judge looked at the evidence. "The evidence is clear," she said. "The fraud is valued at $5 billion. The intent is proven by the hardware logs that are undeniable." She picked up her gavel. It was a piece of wood that was dark and heavy. "Marcus Vane," she said, "I am denying your bail. You will be held in a facility that is high security until your sentencing." The gavel hit the desk. Clang. The sound was like a hammer that was hitting the soul of Marcus. He was dragged out of the room by 2 marshals. He was screaming about milliseconds. He was screaming about the latency of the judge. But the doors closed, and the only sound left was the slow, steady tick of the clock. I stood up and walked out of the court. I had more than 2,000 words of evidence in my bag, and every single one of them was a nail in the coffin of Marcus Vane. The holding cell at the Federal Detention Center was a box that was made of concrete and felt like a tomb. Marcus Vane sat on a bunk that was thin and hard. He was wearing a jumpsuit that was orange and felt like sandpaper against his skin. There were no monitors. There were no data streams. There was only the sound of a faucet that was leaky and dripped once every 2 seconds. 1, 2, 3. To Marcus, that drip was a delay that was infinite. His brain was a machine that was built for high-frequency trading. He was used to seeing 10,000 trades in a single blink of an eye. But here, in this room that was silent and grey, time was a weight that was crushing him. He began to tap his finger against the wall. He was trying to count the milliseconds. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. He was trying to find a rhythm that was fast enough to keep him sane. But the world outside was slow. The world outside was honest. A guard walked past the bars. He was carrying a small television that was old and had a screen that flickered. He placed it on a stand in the hallway. "Look at this, Vane," the guard said. "Your friend is on the news." Marcus scrambled to the bars. He pressed his face against the cold steel. On the screen, the image of the Vesper building appeared, but the name was different. The gold letters that once spelled Vane had been stripped away. In their place were letters that were silver and spelled Thorn Systems. I was standing on the balcony of the 88th floor. I was wearing a suit that was black and fit perfectly. I was holding a glass of water that was clear and reflected the sun. The news anchor spoke with a voice that was excited. "Elias Thorne has officially completed the acquisition of the assets of the firm," the anchor said. "Using his whistleblower bounty of $300 million, Mr. Thorne has turned the company into a non-profit center for market integrity." The camera moved to show the penthouse on Park Avenue that used to belong to Marcus. Men were carrying out the statues that were made of marble and the paintings that were worth millions. "Mr. Thorne has announced that the Vane estate will be sold at a public auction," the anchor continued. "The proceeds will be used to pay for the legal fees of the families who were victims of the dark pool fraud. Marcus Vane, who is currently awaiting a sentence of 25 years, has been declared bankrupt by the federal court." "No," Marcus screamed. He grabbed the bars and shook them with a strength that was born of madness. "That is my life, Elias. You cannot take the penthouse." The guard laughed. "He does not need to take it, Vane. He already owns it." The guard pushed a small package through the slot in the door. It was a delivery that had arrived from the office of the liquidator. Marcus tore the paper open with his teeth. Inside was a piece of metal that was twisted and grey. It was the steel tuning fork that Marcus had crushed under his heel. There was a small card that was attached to the metal. The card had one sentence that was written in ink that was black. "The latency is over." Marcus let out a howl that was long and sounded like a dying animal. He threw the tuning fork against the wall, but it did not make a sound that was loud. It just fell to the floor and stayed still. He realized then that he was no longer a player in the game. He was the friction that had been removed. He was the noise that had been silenced. I sat in the office that used to be a cage for the ego of Marcus. I looked at the server racks that were now cool and quiet. The new software was running with a precision that was absolute. There were no hidden fees. There were no manual overrides. Inspector Sterling walked in. He was holding a document that was official and bore the seal of the SEC. "It is done, Elias," the inspector said. "The market has stabilized. The trust has been restored. What are you going to do now?" I picked up my black titanium tuning fork. I tapped it against the desk that was made of glass. The vibration was pure and lasted for 10 seconds. "I am going to watch the sunset," I said, "and for the first time in 10 years, I am not going to count the milliseconds." I stood up and walked to the elevator. I did not look at the mahogany table. I did not look at the empty chair of the CEO. I walked out into the air that was fresh and filled with the sounds of a city that was moving at a human speed. Behind me, the 88th floor went dark. The war of the nanoseconds was finished, and the architect was finally home.
Watching a man who values nanoseconds spend the rest of his life counting drips from a leaky prison faucet is the kind of poetic justice that actually makes the world feel balanced for once. Elias didn't just win, he hit the permanent delete key on Marcus's entire existence. Now honestly, would you have the guts to burn down a multi-billion-dollar firm just to keep your soul? Or is a $300 million bounty the only thing that would make you pull the trigger? Between us, I almost let Marcus escape to Zurich, but seeing him in that sandpaper jumpsuit felt way too satisfying to pass up.